Night begins the way ancient prophets claimed revelations did, too slowly to notice, too quickly to stop, and with a suspicious amount of whispering behind your back. And perhaps it is fitting, poetically, tragically, ironically fitting, that a story about prophecy should begin in that heavy blue hour where nothing is quite holy, nothing is quite sinful, and everything smells faintly of dust, wet stone, and unwashed intentions. Let us begin with a thought gently wrapped in candle smoke. What if being chosen by the divine was not a blessing, but the most exhausting performance review in the universe? There is something almost comical about it, isn't there? Humanity spends centuries begging for signs, omens, divine text messages carved into thunderclouds, but the moment someone actually receives a sign, an authentic, undeniable celestial memo, they immediately realize what no scripture ever dared to print in ink. Prophecy is the worst job imaginable. Oh yes, worse than being a medieval dentist, worse than being the person who has to test if a berry is poisonous, worse than being the poor monk responsible for counting exactly how many eyelashes the saints left behind before ascension. Prophets are walking customer service windows for the divine, a help desk staffed entirely by one nervous soul and 1,000 desperate believers looking for refunds on their spiritual anxieties. Imagine it. You're trying to sleep, curled under a wool blanket that smells like old sheep and newer regrets, when suddenly, bam, a voice booms inside your skull like a cosmic landlord demanding rent. Or perhaps a shimmering angel appears, wings unfurling like freshly laundered linen, only to deliver a message that makes absolutely no sense until centuries later, when scholars gather in dusty rooms to argue about what you really meant, usually while misquoting you. And through it all, you, the unfortunate prophet, are expected to remain serene, eloquent, endlessly wise, and, oh yes, available 24/7 for miracles, as if holiness came with an overtime plan. It is deliciously absurd, isn't it? Sacred absurdity, spiritual bureaucracy, existential customer support. Tonight, as you sink deeper into the quiet shadows of your room, as the soft glow of your screen forms a little altar on your pillow, we will wander together through the smoky corridors of an ancient life. Someone who never applied for the job of prophet, never polished a resume of virtues, never auditioned for sainthood, and certainly never asked to be responsible for the cosmic mail service. He was simply chosen. And like most people chosen for anything important, he immediately regretted it. His name, well, names change with sand and centuries, so let us choose one that tastes old and slightly tragic. Elias of the dust path, a man whose sandals were always falling apart, whose beard grew unevenly no matter how many prayers he whispered over it, and whose eyes carried that distant glow of someone who slept poorly and believed reluctantly. Elias did not consider himself wise. He did not even consider himself particularly pious. He prayed because everyone else prayed, sang hymns because silence made him uncomfortable, and nodded solemnly at every religious debate because he had long ago learned that the holiest way to avoid arguments was to simply look profound. He had the unsettling gift of looking thoughtful, even when he was thinking about nothing at all. And this innocent, absent-minded talent was his undoing, because the divine, in all its majestic humor, loves choosing unlikely vessels, the humble, the quiet, the ones who look like they can be easily bullied into enlightenment. On the night his life unraveled, Elias was doing what many reluctant holy men do, trying to stay warm by a crumbling clay lamp that flickered like a nervous confession. The air smelled of charred sage, spilled oil, and the faint, sweet decay of old scriptures. Outside his little cell in the monastery, wind dragged its fingers through the hollow corridors, making the place groan like an elderly choir that had not rehearsed enough. He should have been asleep. He should have been dreaming modest dreams, bread rising in the oven, fresh figs, unburned incense. But instead, he sat awake, eyes half open, half closed, entirely tired, pondering the most dangerous question any person of faith can ever whisper into the darkness. What if I'm getting all of this wrong? And oh, how the universe adores an existential crisis. Because the moment Elias posed that trembling question, the air shifted. A tiny tremor passed over his spine, as though someone had lightly tapped his soul to make sure it was still functional. The candle flame sharpened into a thin, golden spear. The shadows rearranged themselves with suspicious purpose. And then, a whisper, soft, silky, pretending to be gentle, the way storms sometimes pretend to be breezes. Elias, you know that moment when someone says your name in the exact tone that suggests your entire life is about to get significantly more complicated? Yes, that one. Elias blinked. Slowly, regrettably, he looked around. Nothing moved, nothing glowed, nothing burned except the candle and his last scrap of peace. Elias, he sighed. Not fear, not awe, just annoyance. Because deep, deep down, beneath layers of doubt, routine prayers, and the polite indifference of spiritual habit, Elias had always suspected that destiny would eventually notice him, and he had spent years successfully hiding from it. But destiny is like a persistent monk knocking on your door, just as you are about to fall asleep. It keeps knocking, and knocking, and knocking. Elias stared at the ceiling as though hoping the whisper would politely go away if ignored long enough. No, he muttered under his breath, not tonight. But divine voices rarely follow human schedules. Before Elias could blow out the candle and pretend to be unconscious, the air in front of him folded. Yes, folded, like parchment being creased by invisible fingers. A faint glow seeped from the seam. Then came the soft rustle of wings, the kind that sound suspiciously theatrical, as though whoever owned them knew the importance of a dramatic entrance. And from that crease in reality stepped a figure robed in light, crowned in silence, and entirely too tall for the room's humble architecture. The being spoke again in a tone that carried galaxies the way good singers carry vowels. Elias of the Dust Path. There it was. Full name. This was serious. Nothing good ever follows the full name. Elias rubbed his face. Can this wait? The celestial figure blinked, surprised. Most prophets greet their angels with trembling reverence or tearful gratitude. Elias looked like he was trying to decline a dinner invitation. I bring a message, the figure intoned, voice echoing with the authority of ancient stone. Yes, Elias murmured wearily, they always do. The angel, if that was indeed the correct title, tilted its head, as though trying to understand why this chosen vessel appeared mostly concerned with the lack of sleep. You have been called. Elias groaned, not in awe, in dread. Here it was. The destiny he never wanted, the job he never applied for. He could almost see his peace of mind packing a small bag and fleeing through a side door. Outside, the wind pressed its face against the window lattice, listening like a gossiping spirit. The candle crackled nervously. The shadows trembled with anticipation. Elias took a deep breath, then offered the only response he felt truly honest enough to give. Are you sure you have the right person? The angel's silence answered everything. The divine rarely double-checks its paperwork. This this weary exchange, this cosmic misunderstanding, this comedic initiation into reluctant holiness, is where our long, dark, poetic journey begins. One man, one calling, one unbearable job description whispered by a celestial emissary who clearly did not understand the concept of personal boundaries. So, before we wander deeper into this labyrinth of sacred confusion and bureaucratic destiny, before we follow Elias into the unraveling of faith, the comedy of miracles, and the quiet tragedy of being chosen, before you settle in pretending this is just background noise, do the holy thing, like the video and subscribe. Only if you feel called by the algorithmic divine, of course. Now take a breath. Let the candle inside the story flicker into your room and feel the soft gravity of what is coming. You are here in the quiet. He is here in the crisis. And the night is only beginning to open its wings. The monastery where Elias lived was the sort of place that made silence feel like an unpaid intern, overworked, underappreciated, constantly hovering behind everyone's footsteps. It clung to the stone walls the way moss clings to old tombs, stubbornly, proudly, with a hint of passive aggression. At dawn, mist drifted through the narrow alleys between the cells, curling like a shy spirit that had lost its way. The scent of damp parchment, extinguished incense, and last night's burnt offerings hung in the air like leftovers from a forgotten ritual. It wasn't a grand monastery, not the kind adorned with gold, stained glass, or pilgrims eager to buy miracle-branded souvenirs. No, this was the other kind, the quiet, half-forgotten kind, where most of the relics were mislabeled and half the manuscripts were written by monks who had fallen asleep mid-sentence. A place where the only treasures were rumors, and the only miracles involved finding a clean pair of sandals. Elias fit right in. He had lived within these cracked stone walls for years, slipping through their routines with the practiced grace of a man who did things out of habit, not conviction. Every morning, as the bell groaned awake like an elderly ox, he shuffled into the prayer hall with the other monks. They knelt, chanted, bowed, rose, bowed again, movements performed with the collective enthusiasm of a group auditioning for the role of sleepy background worshiper. Elias moved among them with the ease of someone who had long mastered the art of seeming devout, while mentally drifting into more appealing thoughts, whether the bread would rise properly today, whether Brother Thomas would accidentally set fire to the incense again, whether God would notice if he prayed with his eyes half closed. He prayed, yes, but he prayed the way one brushes their teeth, dutifully, mechanically, often wondering if it makes any difference at all. The temple halls echoed with hymns, some earnest, most off-key. The walls were lined with tattered tapestries depicting stories that looked far more heroic than they likely were. In one, a prophet split a river in half. In another, a saint calmed a storm by glaring at it sternly. In every image, the holy figures looked confident, radiant, utterly at peace with their divine assignments. Elias considered these portraits the height of false advertising, not because he doubted the miracles, but because none of them showed the exhaustion, the paperwork, the spiritual migraines, the constant stream of believers requesting divine intervention, the way hungry travelers request extra bread. No one ever painted a prophet asleep at his desk, ink smudged, eyes swollen, muttering, "I did not sign up for this." But Elias imagined it, often. His cell was a small stone room with a wooden cot, exactly 2 chairs, one for him and one for the existential dread that visited nightly, and a collection of scrolls he swore he'd read one day. A thin clay lamp sat on the floor beside his bed, casting a warm, uneven glow that made the shadows look like tired spirits lounging after a long shift. He liked his room. He liked the quiet. He liked pretending his life was simple. Unfortunately, the divine had never been particularly respectful of personal boundaries or quiet evenings. Still, Elias tried. Every day he tried to remain invisible to destiny, slipping through routines like a monk-shaped shadow. He swept the courtyard while reciting prayers under his breath, though half the time he accidentally recited recipes. He watered the garden of medicinal herbs, whispering encouragement to the wilting plants like a disappointed father. He copied manuscripts with a handwriting that scholars centuries later would blame on humidity, exhaustion, or demonic interference. His fellow monks saw him as gentle, soft-spoken, reliable, the type of man who would give you his cloak if you were cold, then apologize for it not being warmer. But beneath that mild exterior simmered something much more dangerous, a mind that questioned everything. Not loudly, not rebelliously, just quietly, persistently, like a dripping faucet in the soul. During evening prayers, as the others chanted with fervor, Elias often found himself drifting. Why did some rituals require incense while others required silence? Why were certain sins unforgivable on Tuesdays but redeemable on Fridays? Why did the divine send messages through dreams when a simple written note would suffice? He never voiced these questions, not because he feared punishment, but because he feared answers. Answers meant change. Change meant responsibility. Responsibility meant the possibility, however faint, of being noticed by forces that had a talent for complicating lives. So Elias folded his doubts neatly and tucked them beside his faith, like letters he didn't want to read, yet refused to throw away. Each evening, after prayers, the monastery's ancient corridors filled with the soft shuffle of sandals, the clinking of bowls, and the murmuring of monks discussing mundane affairs with the solemnity of philosophers. It was always the same debate: which herbs cured headaches, whether Brother Tomas should be banned from fire, how many steps it truly took to reach enlightenment. Elias listened with half an ear, amused. Theirs was a world built on contradictions, rituals, and spiritual shortcuts disguised as wisdom, a world where saints were revered, sinners were pitied, and doubt was quietly swept under the rug like dust that no broom dared confront. He didn't mind the absurdity. He even found comfort in it. There was something reassuring about belonging to a tradition that had survived thousands of years despite, perhaps because of, its inconsistencies. The days passed like that, soft, slow, full of incense and unanswered questions. Elias woke at dawn, prayed by habit, worked by necessity, questioned by nature, slept by exhaustion. He assumed his life would continue in this gentle, monotonous rhythm forever. He assumed the divine had more important people to bother. He assumed he was safe from anything resembling purpose. Naturally, he was wrong, because the divine is notoriously unpredictable in its hiring practices. One moment you are sweeping dust from the temple floor. The next moment you are being interviewed for the position of reluctant messenger of eternal truths, a title that comes with no benefits, no vacation days, and far too much attention. You, listening in the hush of your room, might imagine Elias as brave, stoic, chosen for hidden virtues. But the truth is much funnier. He simply looked available. He blended into the background too well, and destiny, always in need of a convenient vessel, mistook his quietness for readiness. But before the celestial whisper came, before the walls folded like parchment and the air shimmered with divine inconvenience, Elias lived in the sacred illusion of normalcy. He liked sweeping the courtyard at dusk, humming hymns without meaning them. He liked watching dust float in the candlelight like tiny drifting prayers no one sent. He liked drinking bitter herbal tea and pretending it cured his doubts. He liked hearing stories of ancient prophets and thinking, poor souls, glad that will never be me. His world was a woven tapestry of habits, fears, quiet joys, and sacred absurdities. A world built from cracked stone, flickering lamps, and the deep, soft hum of collective faith. Faith that was sincere yet slightly frayed at the edges, like most human beliefs. And through it all, Elias drifted like incense smoke, aimlessly, beautifully, philosophically, hoping that the heavens would keep their distance. If only the heavens had listened. Because on that night, the night when everything began to unravel, the sanctuary that had always felt so comforting suddenly felt too small, too quiet, too prepared, as though the walls had been waiting, as though the dust had been whispering, as though every shadow had known his name long before the angel spoke it. And while Elias stood at the edge of sleep, unaware of the cosmic paperwork being filed in his name, fate sharpened its quill, dipped it into the ink of inevitability, and wrote the first line of his new job description. Prophet, against his will, without his consent, irrevocably. And that, dear listener wandering through the night with us, is how the universe prepares a man for his calling, quietly, ironically, ruthlessly, with dust, with doubts, and with a life so ordinary that destiny cannot resist the urge to ruin it. Now the candle trembles again, as if remembering the moment before everything changed. And Elias, poor Elias, is still inside that moment, not yet aware that the soft routine he loves is about to be shattered by divine inconvenience. The night leans closer. You lean closer. His story deepens. Before destiny dragged Elias into its bureaucratic labyrinth of holy obligations, he actually believed, quietly, politely, almost shyly, in the comforting architecture of faith. Not the blinding, thunderous faith sung about in hymns or carved into the triumphant brows of statues. No, Elias possessed what one might call a soft faith, the kind you can fold neatly and tuck into a pocket, right next to your doubts and the crumbs from yesterday's bread. He believed in miracles the way you might believe in discounts at the marketplace, with cautious optimism, full awareness of possible scams, and a silent understanding that things rarely work out exactly as advertised. It wasn't that he doubted the divine. He doubted humans, especially their tendency to embroider every story until even the truth doesn't recognize itself. Yet even with his skepticism gently simmering in the background, Elias carried a genuine, almost tender affection for the idea of the sacred. For him, the divine was not a roaring fire demanding devotion, but rather a quiet ember in a dark room, warm, patient, flickering just enough to remind him that something inexplicable hovered in the spaces between breaths. Every morning, before the bells finished coughing themselves awake, Elias lingered in the chapel alone. It was the only time the temple felt honest. Before the chanting, before the communal obligations, before the expectations of spiritual performance began. In that solitude, with nothing but the sound of dust drifting through the air, he whispered small prayers, not grand ones, not heroic ones, just gentle murmurs from a man who needed the universe to know he was trying. He prayed for clarity, for inner stillness, for a few days without Brother Thomas setting something on fire, for peace, not enlightenment, not glory, not prophetic importance, just peace, though peace, as the divine would soon remind him, is the one thing prophets never receive. But at that time, Elias had no such worries. He had rituals, fragile but comforting. He had a faith built from the dust of old scriptures and the glow of half-believed stories. His spirituality was made of quiet metaphors. God as a patient scribe, writing humanity's messy tales in the margins, angels as librarians sorting the world's unfiled miracles, destiny as a slightly disorganized clerk trying to keep track of everyone's requests. It was a harmless religion, the kind that made life bearable without demanding too much in return. When he thought about the heavens, he pictured an enormous library with endless shelves of luminous scrolls, each labeled with the names of mortals who had prayed, doubted, begged, bargained, and occasionally shouted into the sky. In his imagination, celestial archivists walked through the aisles, sighing deeply, because most human requests were repetitive, contradictory, or inconveniently vague. And yet, in that vast library of divine paperwork, Elias imagined his own scroll, a tiny one, somewhere near the bottom of an unimportant shelf. Maybe between minor requests from people who mostly mean well, and humans who believe but wouldn't bet money on it. Yes, that sounded right. Elias never thought himself worthy of divine attention, which, ironically, is probably why he was chosen. Still, there was a time when he believed with a sincerity untainted by cosmic interference. Long before the angel unfolded itself into his room, long before the prophetic nightmare began, Elias' faith was a soft, steady companion. Not dramatic, not boastful, just present. Like the steady ticking of a clock you don't notice until it stops. He believed in the divine the way a child believes a parent loves them, even when that parent forgets birthdays or occasionally knocks over the clay lantern. You trust because trusting is easier than unraveling the entire metaphysical mess. His prayers, though simple, carried an emotional honesty most prophets lose after the first revelation-induced headache. He prayed for mercy on days when he felt small. He prayed for patience on days when he felt large. He prayed for forgiveness on days when he felt it was safest to just assume he'd done something wrong. And sometimes, only sometimes, he prayed for a sign. Not a big sign. Not a burning bush or a talking animal or a star rearranging itself into his name. Just something modest, like a feather falling in a meaningful direction, or a whisper floating down from nowhere saying, "You're doing fine. Keep sweeping." It was the kind of faith that felt more like a conversation than a command, more like a sigh than a hymn. Even when he doubted, his doubt felt sacred. Like a candle flickering in a draught, like a monk who hasn't slept asking half-heartedly, "Are we sure this is the right path?" He didn't see doubt as betrayal. He saw it as breathing room, as the necessary darkness that makes a flame visible. And perhaps because Elias was never arrogant in his spirituality, never claimed to understand the divine, never strutted through the temple with the bombastic confidence of those convinced they were spiritually superior, he remained strangely, beautifully humble. Humility, of course, is the universe's favorite weakness. It attracts divine assignments like honey attracts flies. But at that time, Elias had no idea. He merely moved through his days with quiet reverence, gentle irony, and a patient acceptance that life was full of mysteries he wasn't meant to solve. He thought prophets were chosen because they wanted the burden. He thought prophets carried wisdom like torches. He thought prophets looked forward to divine instructions. He thought prophets were born different, shining, radiant, spiritually coordinated. He never once considered that prophets might simply be the poor souls who happened to be awake at the wrong time. Still, even with his reservations, Elias admired the idea of prophecy, at least the sanitized version the monastery taught. He thought of prophets as wise wanderers, whisperers of truth, bearers of sacred insight. Not once did he imagine them exhausted, sleep-deprived, confused, or annoyed. The scrolls never mention the part where a prophet stubs his toe on a stone altar or spills ink on a revelation. Elias believed in the beauty of purpose. He believed in destiny like one believes in distant thunderstorms, fascinated but happy when they stay far away. He believed in the divine, but with a healthy appreciation for its sense of humor. He believed in himself just enough to function, never enough to attract unwanted cosmic attention. And he believed deeply that his life would remain simple, that his duties would stay small, that God had more interesting people to bother. He believed all of this so earnestly, so sincerely, so peacefully, that fate could not resist proving him wrong. But that night, before the whisper, before the unfolding, before the angel appeared, carrying a job description he would never escape, Elias lived in a delicate spiritual balance. Faith and doubt, reverence and irony, belief and exasperation. A tapestry woven from contradictions, held together by ritual and sleep deprivation. Some nights, he would sit under the open sky, look at the stars arranged like scattered thoughts, and wonder if heaven ever looked back at him. He hoped not. He prayed not. He feared yes. But even then, even in his fear, there was poetry. Because Elias believed in a divine presence woven into the dust, into the cracks of the walls, into the amber glow of the clay lamps. He felt watched not by a judge, but by a storyteller waiting for him to say something interesting. His faith was a quiet confession whispered into the night. I don't understand, but I'm here. That was the heart of him. Soft, sincere. A man whose devotion was made of small gestures. A man who tried. A man who cared even when pretending he didn't. And maybe that is why the divine chose him. Not because he was strong, not because he was wise, but because he believed gently, without ambition, without arrogance, without the nauseating confidence of people who think God owes them explanations. No. Elias believed the way a tired monk believes the sun will rise, not because he knows, but because he hopes. And it was that hope, fragile, trembling, human, that destiny targeted with ruthless affection. The night before the revelation, Elias whispered one final prayer, so soft the air barely heard it. Let tomorrow be ordinary. A perfect prayer, really. Soft, human, tragically ironic, because tomorrow would be anything but ordinary. Tomorrow the divine would interrupt everything he thought he understood. Tomorrow his faith would crack open like an egg dropped on stone. Tomorrow simplicity would crumble. Tomorrow the job of prophet would be pinned to him like a badge he could not remove. But on this night, this precious, fragile night, Elias still believed in peace. He still believed in silence. He still believed in his small place in the great cosmic machinery. And the heavens, amused as always, inhaled deeply, preparing to blow his entire worldview off the table. The night the seed of doubt truly rooted itself inside Elias did not arrive with thunder or celestial, trumpets, or any of those theatrically convenient signs the scriptures love to brag about. No. It crept in quietly, with the soft manners of a polite intruder who wipes their feet before breaking into your house. It began with a dream, if one could even call it a dream. Elias had drifted into sleep the way tired monks often do. Suddenly, awkwardly, like a candle collapsing under its own flame. His mind, always slightly frayed at the edges, slipped into the kind of half-conscious wandering where images appear without asking permission, and thoughts behave like stray dogs looking for scraps. He found himself standing in a vast, echoing hall made of nothing but parchment. Walls of parchment, floors of parchment, ceilings that fluttered like giant wings made of scrolls. Every surface was covered in tiny, ink-smudged handwriting. Lines written by trembling prophets, scribbles from exhausted scribes, footnotes added by celestial proofreaders with questionable handwriting, and in the distance, echoing, humming, whispering, a voice reciting every word ever prayed by anyone, anywhere. A droning chorus of centuries-old desperation. It sounded strangely like the world's most overwhelmed librarian reading the overdue notices of all humanity. Elias walked, or floated, or simply existed forward. Dreams rarely care about the specifics. As he approached the center of the parchment hall, he noticed a long table carved from pure silence. Upon it lay a single quill, still dripping cosmic ink. He understood instinctively that this was where revelations were written, where destinies were assigned, where prophets were chosen the way one chooses who will carry a heavy box up 3 flights of stairs. Elias examined the quill with a mixture of awe and poorly concealed irritation. Even in dreams, destiny had a bothersome punctuality. Then he noticed the scroll beside the quill. It glowed faintly. It hummed softly. It had his name on it. He froze, not out of pride, not out of fear, but out of profound, bone-deep inconvenience. "Not me," he whispered to no one. "I'm busy." But the scroll ignored him entirely and unfurled itself with a dramatic flourish, as if it had been waiting for this moment since the dawn of time. Inside, written in shimmering ink, were the first 3 lines. Elias of the Dust Path designated messenger pending activation. He exhaled sharply, the universal sound for absolutely not. A shadow moved at the far end of the hall, a presence, a silhouette, something tall, luminous, and clearly overworked. Ah, yes, the divine intern in charge of prophetic assignments. The figure approached slowly, with the weary grace of someone who had been delivering cosmic memos for far too many centuries. Its face, or what passed for a face, held that particular expression shared by school teachers, tax collectors, and angels, forced to deal with reluctant humans. A mixture of patience and barely concealed frustration. "Elias," the figure said, its voice rippling through the parchment walls like a breeze across old pages. "No, thank you," Elias replied reflexively. The figure blinked. Dream or not, it had not expected to be declined. "You have been chosen." "For what?" "A sacred task." "Ah," Elias said, nodding slowly. "I see. And is there perhaps a form I can fill out to decline the offer?" "There is no declining." "Of course not," he sighed. "Heaven runs like every other bureaucracy." The figure waved a long, luminous hand over the scroll, and words began etching themselves rapidly, as though destiny had grown impatient. Elias tried to read them, but they blurred, smudged, rewrote themselves. Typical. Even his prophetic dream was written in divine shorthand. "This is your calling," the figure said. "Is it, though?" Elias ventured. "Is it truly? I mean, surely there are people more qualified, people with stronger faith, people who don't spend half their prayers thinking about bread." The parchment walls rustled disapprovingly, as if shamed by his honesty. "You will deliver the message," the figure insisted. "What message?" The figure opened its mouth. Or perhaps the ceiling opened. Or perhaps the entire dream expanded into a vast echo. It's hard to say. Dreams are notoriously imprecise historians. A single word was spoken, a word the world had waited centuries to hear, a word that carried the weight of creation, destruction, transformation. But Elias didn't hear it. He sneezed, loudly. The word dissolved before reaching his ears, scattering into glowing dust. The figure stared at him, deeply offended. "Did you just—" "It's the parchment," Elias muttered defensively. "I'm allergic to divine bureaucracy." The hall trembled. The voice of the figure dipped into the octave reserved for cosmic disappointment. "You will receive the message again," it intoned. "Soon." "When?" "Soon." He hated that answer. "Soon" is the least helpful prophecy ever delivered. It was then that the parchment hall began to peel away, dissolving into drifting flakes. The scroll curled shut. The quill evaporated. The floor beneath him softened into clouds or smoke or memory. And as everything vanished, he heard the figure murmur one last sentence. "You cannot hide from your purpose." The dream snapped. Elias woke with a gasp, covered in cold sweat, tangled in his blanket like a man who had been wrestling with his own destiny and losing. The candle beside his bed had died hours earlier. The room smelled of old stone and the faint ghost of burnt sage. Shadows clung to the corners like creatures pretending not to watch him. He pressed a hand to his forehead. His pulse throbbed. His mind raced. His doubts, once soft and manageable, now towered like storm clouds. He whispered into the darkness, "No, absolutely not. I refuse." The silence that followed felt smug. But the dream was only the beginning. Doubt blooms, quietly, methodically. It doesn't storm through the door screaming. It slips in through the cracks, humming lullabies of uncertainty. Throughout the next day, little things began to unravel. During morning prayers, he lost his place in the liturgy, a text he could recite even while half asleep or fully bored. During breakfast, his spoon bent inexplicably in his hand. During chores, every broom he touched snapped in half. During copying duties, his ink blotted into shapes that resembled wings and unreadable symbols. Brother Thomas joked that perhaps he was cursed. Elias found himself wishing that were true. It would have been simpler. But no. He felt something else, a pressure, a tug, a subtle pulling at the threads of his life, as though unseen fingers were gently unraveling his quiet existence, stitch by stitch. That night, as he walked through the courtyard under the trembling glow of lanterns, he felt watched. Not maliciously, not threateningly, just observed. Like a student being evaluated by a teacher who had assigned homework without warning. He whispered into the evening air, "I don't want this." The wind responded by knocking over an empty clay pot. Subtle. Too subtle. Still, it was enough. The seed of doubt, which had always lived quietly in him, folded among his thoughts like a sleeping moth, finally stretched its wings. What if the dream was real? What if the message was real? What if he, Elias of the dust path, the man who could not keep plants alive or fold robes evenly, was truly being summoned into the sacred chaos of prophecy? His stomach tightened. His chest ached. He felt simultaneously chosen and targeted. He looked up at the sky, a vast ink surface dotted with stars, and whispered a trembling accusation. "Why me?" A shooting star streaked overhead, magnificent and dramatic. Elias groaned. "Very subtle," he muttered. "But no." He turned away, refusing to acknowledge the cosmic wink. But the sky, smug as ever, twinkled back knowingly. Because doubt had taken root. Not the shallow doubt that makes you wonder whether you left the door unlocked, but the deep, existential kind. the kind that redefines everything, the kind that whispers in your ear long after silence returns, the kind that smells like incense and destiny and trouble. All through that night, Elias lay awake, shifting under his worn blanket, plagued by questions that skittered through his thoughts like restless moths. Was the dream divine? Was it just exhaustion? Was he hallucinating? Was God playing riddles again? Was he chosen? Was he cursed? Was there even a difference? By sunrise, he had reached one definitive conclusion. He did not want to know the answer, but simply wanting ignorance is no shield against revelation. The universe has never respected such boundaries. And so the seed of doubt, now awake, now hungry, began to bloom, slowly, steadily, inevitably. Elias could feel its roots winding through him, through his prayers, through his certainties, through the quiet little faith he had spent years tending like a fragile plant. The divine had whispered, destiny had stirred, and doubt, sacred, poisonous, transformative doubt, had entered his bloodstream. Nothing would ever be simple again. Nothing would ever be quiet again. Nothing would ever belong solely to him again. He did not yet know it, but that dream had opened the first crack in the vessel of his soul. And through that crack, the entire weight of prophecy would soon come flooding in. Crisis doesn't arrive like a tempest, despite what the sacred texts love to brag about. Crisis arrives quietly, like a monk tiptoeing late into prayer, hoping no one notices. Like a candle running out of wax mid-hymn. Like doubt sharpening its teeth in the corner of your mind. For Elias, the descent began subtly. So subtly that if he had been less observant or more spiritually indifferent, he might have ignored it entirely. But once you have dreamt of divine paperwork bearing your name, once you have seen celestial ink-etch warnings onto your destiny, reality becomes embarrassingly hard to ignore. The first sign came during morning prayers. The monks chanted the ancient hymns together, their voices rising and falling in imperfect unison. The hall smelled of incense, thick, sweet, and slightly burnt, because Brother Thomas had once again used too much of the resin that smelled like heavenly bread, according to him, and smelled like divine arson, according to everyone else. Elias muttered the familiar lines, letting his lips move automatically. For years, this ritual had been a comfortable lullaby, predictable as dawn. But that morning, the words felt heavy. Each syllable dropped from his tongue like wet sand. Each verse echoed in his head with the weight of a question. Are you speaking to God, or just repeating what people expect you to say? The doubt clung to the edges of his prayer like a shadow. He shook it off, or tried. But the next verse caught in his throat. He swallowed. He tried again. Nothing came out. His voice, his small, useless voice, failed him. He coughed to cover it up. The monk beside him glanced over with mild concern. The monk behind him glared, assuming it was another one of Elias's allergies. Only Elias knew that the silence in his throat felt like a locked door. The second sign arrived during his chores. He went to fetch water from the well, the rope rough against his palms. The morning sun filtered through the courtyard, painting the stones gold. A soft breeze carried the scent of damp earth and wild herbs. Normally, this was his favorite time of day, quiet, slow, meditative. But as he lowered the bucket, he noticed something strange. The ropes trembled, not with weight, with rhythm. A peculiar, eerie rhythm, like someone tapping gently on the other end. Tap, tap, tap. He paused. Leaning over the well, he peered into the deep blue darkness below. Nothing moved. Nothing shimmered, nothing breathed. Yet the rope pulsed again, rhythmically, insistently, almost impatiently. Elias let go. The rope stilled. The well stared back at him like an unblinking eye. He grabbed the bucket and hurried away, whispering a quiet plea to the universe. No more weirdness today, please. The universe, as usual, ignored him. The third sign arrived during his scribing duties. He sat at the long wooden table in the scriptorium, sunlight filtering through narrow windows and scattering golden dust across the manuscripts. The room was quiet except for the gentle scratching of quills and the occasional frustrated sigh from a monk who had ruined an entire parchment with one misplaced ink blot. Elias dipped his quill, took a steadying breath, and began copying the sacred text assigned to him. A harmless set of hymns about gratitude, humility, and not stealing extra bread from the communal basket. But as he wrote, his hand trembled, just a little at first, then more and more. The lines wavered, the letters blurred. He blinked hard, leaned closer, tried again. But the ink was wrong. Instead of forming neat, disciplined letters, it curled into spirals and shapes he did not recognize, symbols that looked like twisted wings, like eyes half opened, like doors ajar. He whispered, "No, no, no," as if he could scold the ink back into obedience. The more he wrote, the stranger it became. Ancient sigils, cryptic curves. Something that looked disturbingly like the outline of the very angel he had seen in his dream. Brother Thomas passed behind him, glanced at the parchment, and said, "Artistic," before wandering off to set something on fire in the courtyard. Elias pressed his trembling hands against his face. He felt heat in his chest, an uncomfortable mixture of panic and recognition. The divine was pushing, pressing, insisting, and Elias was resisting with all the force of a man trying to hold back the tide with a broom. By late afternoon, the crisis had fully arrived. He found himself in the courtyard again, sweeping fallen leaves with the slow, meditative strokes of someone trying to convince the universe he was too busy for destiny. The sky had turned a pale gray, soft as old parchment. The wind carried the faint hum of distant chanting. Then the world shifted. Just slightly, barely noticeable, but enough. The shadows lengthened unnaturally. The breeze stilled mid-breath. The leaves on the ground trembled like frightened insects. Elias looked up. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. The air thickened as though drenched in invisible oil. Light warped, sound folded. His breath caught. His pulse raced. A shape flickered at the edge of his vision, just for a moment. A tall, luminous silhouette standing between two olive trees. Elias blinked. It vanished. He told himself, "You're tired." But fatigue doesn't usually bend sunlight into halos. He resumed sweeping. The broom immediately snapped in half. For the third time that day, he dropped the pieces. "Fine," he muttered bitterly, "very subtle. Crisis rarely listens when you ask it to come back later. Instead, it pulls up a chair, sits next to you, and begins unpacking all the things you've avoided thinking about." And that night, oh, that night, the unraveling truly began. Elias tried to sleep. He really did. He lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft creak of the old monastery breathing in the dark. The clay lamp beside him burned low, casting uneven shadows across the stone walls. But his mind spun in frantic circles. Every thought collided with the next. Every memory echoed with new meaning. Every fear whispered, "What if?" He closed his eyes tightly. The angel from his dream stood behind his eyelids, tall and shimmering and annoyingly silent. He turned onto his side. The parchment hall unrolled itself in the darkness behind him. He turned the other way. The celestial scroll blazed with his name. He sat up, clutching his blanket like a child warding off imaginary monsters. Except his monsters weren't imaginary. They were metaphysical, spiritual, possibly administrative. The room felt too small, the air too heavy. His skin buzzed with a strange electricity, as though some invisible current was flowing beneath it. He whispered into the dimness, "Please stop. I'm not ready." The silence responded with the tender cruelty of inevitability. A soft sound stirred near the door, a whisper, a faint rustle, like someone turning the page of a very large, very ancient book. Elias froze. Then, light. Not bright, not blinding, just a soft, shimmering glow, like moonlight being poured from a cup. It seeped under the door, curling gently toward him like a curious animal. He tried to stand. His legs refused. He tried to breathe. His lungs protested. The glow crept closer, closer. It brushed against his hand, warm, buzzing, sentient. He gasped. Not again. No, no more. But the glow continued its gentle inspection, as if checking whether he was the correct delivery address. Then it whispered, a single word, a word he could not decipher, a word that rang inside him like a bell struck underwater. He felt it ripple through his ribs, his throat, his thoughts. Then it was gone. Just gone. The glow withdrew, the silence returned, the shadows settled. Elias sat trembling in the dim room, heart pounding, skin tingling, soul unraveling. He knew then, without doubt, without metaphor, without escape, that the divine was no longer whispering to him. It was calling him, firmly, persistently, relentlessly, and that he, Elias of the dust path, simple monk, tired man, reluctant dreamer, was tumbling helplessly into the sacred chaos of prophecy. His crisis had begun, not loud, not dramatic, but quiet, insidious, inevitable, like a candle burning too close to parchment. The night Elias finally broke, truly broke, spiritually, philosophically, embarrassingly, did not begin with a scream. No. That would have been too easy, too theatrical, too merciful. Instead, it began with something much more dangerous. Absolute silence. Not the peaceful silence of monks lost in prayer. Not the gentle hush of wind drifting through olive branches, but the deep, cavernous, bone-hollow silence of a world holding its breath. Elias woke into it abruptly, as though ripped from a dream he had no memory of. His eyes snapped open, staring at the wooden ceiling above him, dark, cracked, familiar. But nothing felt familiar. The air tasted wrong. The shadows looked wrong. He felt wrong. It was as if the universe had briefly shut itself off and forgotten to turn the sound back on. He sat up slowly, heart knocking against his ribcage like someone trapped inside a small wooden box. The moonlight poured through the narrow window, blue and cold, painting stripes across the room like prison bars. Somewhere in the monastery, a bell should have been ringing to signal the dawn prayers, but nothing rang. No footsteps, no shifting robes, no murmurs of sleepy monks preparing for another day of holy repetition. Only silence, total, radiant, alarming. Elias stood, legs trembling. He moved toward the door of his cell, opened it cautiously, and froze. The corridor stretched before him, empty and glowing faintly, with a strange, soft luminescence, as though the air itself were shimmering with invisible dust. It reminded him of the glow that had slipped under his door days earlier, the glow that had whispered a word he still did not understand. He stepped into the hallway. His sandals slapped softly against the stone. The sound vanished instantly, swallowed by the silence like a pebble tossed into deep water. He walked, slowly, carefully, half convinced he would find the entire monastery vanished, replaced by that parchment-walled dream or a cosmic void full of filing cabinets and overworked angels. He passed the meditation chamber, empty, the scriptorium, empty, the courtyard, empty, except for a single broom standing upright, something no broom had ever managed to do in the history of the monastery. Elias swallowed hard. "Very funny," he whispered to the heavens. His voice sounded small, almost swallowed by the vastness of the silence. He pushed open the last door, the great wooden door leading into the main temple hall. And that is where the quiebra, the fracture, the sacred collapse of his sanity finally occurred. The hall was not empty. Oh no, it was full, full to the brim with light, not sunlight, not lamplight, not even divine light in the elegant, ethereal sense that bards write poems about. No, this light was messy, chaotic, flickering, pulsing, sputtering like a celestial lantern with a faulty wick. It poured from the ceiling in uneven bursts, dripped down the stone walls like honey, hovered in the air like golden dust caught in some cosmic draught. Elias blinked at it. The light blinked back, literally. And then it spoke, not with a voice, with a presence. A pressure that filled the room, pressed against his ribs, seeped into his lungs. A hum, not heard, but felt, deep in the marrow of his bones. He stumbled backward, gripping a pillar carved centuries ago by monks who would have fainted instantly at the sight before him. The light surged, gathered, coalesced, and then, from its shimmering folds, something stepped forward, or unfolded, or manifested, or simply appeared, the way divine things often do, skipping the transition phases entirely. It was tall, too tall, taller than any living thing had a right to be. Its form shimmered, vague yet unbearably present, wings like fractured glass, eyes like molten gold, face shifting between serenity and mild irritation. The angel from his dream, or its sibling, or its overworked supervisor. It stood there, luminous, monumental, radiating an aura that alternated rapidly between holy revelation and cosmic paperwork emergency. Elias did not bow. He did not kneel. He did not pray. He stared at the figure with the exhausted expression of someone who has reached the end of their tolerance for divine theatrics. "Oh," he whispered hoarsely, "it's you again." The angel tilted its head, producing a soft sound like pages turning. "You are called," it said, its voice echoing everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the air like a harp played inside his skull. "No." Elias shook his head violently. "Absolutely not. I'm not doing this. I am unqualified. I can't even keep a broom intact. You are chosen. By mistake. There are no mistakes in divine selection." Elias threw his hands up in exasperation. "Oh, please, even Brother Tomas makes fewer mistakes than whatever cosmic lottery assigned me this job, and he once set fire to a bucket of water." The angel blinked, confused. Celestial beings do not usually have to process mortal sarcasm. "You will deliver the message," it repeated, as though Elias simply had not heard. He had heard. He wished he hadn't. "I won't," Elias insisted. "I can't. I'm not—" "You will." "No." The angel's wings unfurled. The hall filled with a roaring wind that came from nowhere, churning dust and incense ash into spirals. The light pulsed violently, casting wild, trembling shadows. Elias staggered backward. His knees buckled. His breath caught. He felt the presence slam into him like a wave, not painful, not gentle, just overwhelming. His mind flooded with images. flashes of mountains splitting open, flashes of stars collapsing inward, flashes of crowds gathering, begging, weeping, flashes of scrolls unrolling themselves endlessly, flashes of his own face, older, worn, hollowed by truths he did not yet know. He screamed, not a loud scream, a cracked, trembling whisper of a scream, the kind that escapes when the soul realizes it cannot run. The angel stepped closer. Its eyes, not eyes, but the idea of eyes, glowed with unbearable intensity. And then, the moment of pure fracture, the divine touched him. Not physically, not even spiritually. More like structurally, as if something reached into the architecture of his being and tugged. His breath shattered. His thoughts dissolved. His doubt tore open like a curtain whipped aside. He felt everything, every prayer ever whispered into the sky, every secret fear trapped in human chests, every unanswered plea, every misguided hymn, every desperate hope. He felt the weight of all those voices crashing over him like a tidal wave of longing. He buckled onto the cold stone floor, gasping, trembling, curling into himself like a wounded animal, overwhelmed, terrified, exposed. The angel's voice thundered, "You will speak." Elias collapsed fully, forehead pressed to the ground. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't. I can't. I can't." The light dimmed. The presence softened. The angel knelt, or approximated kneeling, its strange, shimmering form folding closer to him. "You will endure," it murmured, "because the world needs a reluctant prophet more than it needs a willing one." Elias choked out a laugh, not a sane laugh, not a humorous laugh, a broken, disbelief-ridden little sound that echoed strangely in the shimmering hall. "Oh, of course," he rasped. "Of course the world wants the one person who doesn't want the job. That is why you were chosen." "Terrible system," Elias whispered. "Absolutely terrible." The angel did not disagree, which was unsettling, very unsettling. The light around them flickered again, softer this time, like fading lanterns. The immense pressure lifted slightly from his chest. His breath returned, ragged, uneven, painful, and then, with a final pulse of golden light, the angel spoke the message, the real message, the one he had missed before, the one meant for him and only him. It whispered, just one word, a word Elias had never heard before, but somehow understood instantly, a word that cracked open the bones of his certainty, a word so ancient it tasted like dust and dawn, a word so heavy it pressed into his soul like a seal. And with that single word, Elias broke, completely, quietly, elegantly. The world dimmed, the hall dissolved. The light folded itself away like a letter returned to its envelope, and Elias, trembling, sweating, hollowed out, collapsed on the cold stone floor as dawn finally broke outside, the bell ringing far too late and far too normal for what had just occurred. He lay there for a long time, staring at nothing, clutching the word in his mind like a burning coal. He had seen the divine. He had been touched by it. He had been nearly consumed by it. And now he understood the terrible, tragic, ironic truth. There is nothing more devastatingly spiritual than a complete failure of certainty. Elias of the dust path, the quiet monk, the reluctant believer, the man who prayed out of politeness, had become a prophet. Against his will, without preparation, against every instinct of self-preservation. And the worst part, he could already feel the world shifting in terrible, beautiful, holy ways around him. The quiebra had come, the breaking was complete, and the true journey, the impossible one, was about to begin. The morning after the breaking did not arrive gently. It arrived like a shy intruder sneaking into a house still trembling from last night's commotion, soft-footed, pale, unwilling to acknowledge what had happened. The first light of dawn crawled across the stone floor of the temple hall with a kind of embarrassed hesitation, as if the sun itself recoiled from illuminating the aftermath of divine intrusion. Elias lay exactly where he had collapsed, curled slightly, fingers twitching as though still clinging to the remnants of a dream not meant for mortal minds. His breathing rasped softly, shallow but steady. He was alive. Technically, functionally alive, but existentially ruined. The silence surrounding him was different now, not the oppressive cosmic silence that had preceded the angel's appearance, not the ordinary, sleepy quiet of a monastery slowly waking up. No, this was a hollowed-out silence, a post-cataclysmic silence, the kind of silence that lingers after thunder has torn the sky open and left it too stunned to sew itself back together. He blinked. The ceiling above him was still the same wooden lattice. The air was still thick with incense, though faint now, diluted by dawn. The stone under him was still cold. But he was different. Something inside him, call it the soul, the mind, the spiritual plumbing, had cracked open and refused to close again. The word whispered by the angel still echoed faintly in the back of his skull like the aftertaste of lightning. He didn't dare repeat it. He didn't dare examine it. He didn't dare acknowledge the way it simmered beneath his ribs like a glowing coal. For several long minutes, Elias simply breathed, in, out, as if learning again, as if breath had become a foreign practice requiring calibration. Finally, with great effort, he pushed himself upright. His limbs shook. His neck protested. His head throbbed with a pain so profound it felt like a newly installed fault line. He whispered hoarsely into the emptiness, "I'm still here," and the emptiness whispered nothing back. It wasn't trying to frighten him. It simply had nothing left to give. Last night had gutted the space, emptied it of sound, drained it of any illusion of safety. He stood slowly, gripping a column as though it might steady more than his balance. The hall around him, once sacred and familiar, now felt like the abandoned casing of something that had molted and moved on. Light filtered through the high windows, pale, dusty, indifferent. The air felt thick with something unnamed. The remnants of divine presence? Or the shockwave left behind after it departed? Hard to say, harder to want to know. Elias stumbled toward the doorway, each step a negotiation between willpower and the lingering tremors in his legs. The world beyond the temple hall greeted him with the muted clatter of morning life. A distant cough, the scrape of pottery, the rustle of robes. The monastery had woken. The world continued, unaware, unmoved, unbothered by the fact that cosmic revelation had collided violently with one of its residents, shattering him into trembling shards. It was almost insulting. Elias stepped into the courtyard. Birds fluttered from the olive trees as if startled by nothing more than his presence. Brother Thomas knelt near the herb garden, muttering a prayer to the rosemary plants in hopes they would behave this year. Two novices swept the dusty stones with an enthusiasm Elias found personally offensive. Everything was normal. And that normalcy felt wrong, inappropriate, almost cruel. Elias stood there, staring at the mundane world as though it were an elaborate lie. The sky above him glowed in soft pinks and golds. The breeze brushed against his cheeks like a familiar friend trying to comfort him. It didn't help. Inside him, the silence pulsed. Not empty, not full, just vast, too vast. It felt like someone had taken his small, modest understanding of reality and swapped it with the blueprint of a cathedral, echoing, towering, impossible to fill. He pressed a hand to his chest, gripping the fabric of his robe. He felt hollow and too full at the same time. A paradox in human skin. That should have been comforting, given he'd spent his entire life surrounded by contradictions, but now it felt suffocating. Every breath rasped against the walls of the new emptiness inside him. The word left by the angel thrummed faintly, as though daring him to speak it aloud. He refused. There are limits to how much madness the mind can tolerate before breakfast. He forced himself to move. Slowly, mechanically. He crossed the courtyard and entered the refectory, where the other monks were seated for morning meal. The scent of warm porridge and stale bread drifted through the room. Clay bowls clinked. Voices murmured. Lamps flickered. A perfectly ordinary morning. A perfectly ordinary world. Elias sat quietly at the end of a bench. A novice placed a bowl before him, bowing politely. Elias nodded, hands trembling slightly as he lifted the spoon. He didn't notice Brother Lucio staring at him, nor Brother Tomas, nor the two novices whispering about the strange light they'd seen flickering from the temple hall before dawn. Finally, Brother Lucio, the closest thing the monastery had to a leader, wisdom poured into a habit woven from equal parts piety and exhaustion, approached him. He sat beside Elias, the bench creaking under his weight. "You look pale," Lucio said softly. Elias stared at his porridge as though it might reveal the mysteries of the universe if examined long enough. "I didn't sleep well. That's becoming a habit," Lucio observed. There was no accusation in his tone, just weary concern. "You were not in your cell this morning. I woke up in the temple hall." Lucio hummed thoughtfully. "That's unusual." A pause. "Did you go there voluntarily?" "I don't remember going," Elias whispered. Lucio's eyebrows rose an imperceptible degree. Monks rarely lied. But when they did, it was usually for reasons involving ghosts, spiritual crises, or the accidental misplacement of relics. "Is something troubling you?" Lucio asked. Elias hesitated. A long, painful hesitation. Because how does one say, "An angel made me collapse, whispered an impossible word into my soul, and I am currently falling apart quietly while pretending to enjoy porridge?" Instead, he said, "Something feels wrong." Lucio studied him. "Wrong how?" Elias swallowed. "The silence is too loud." Lucio blinked. "Ah," he said gently, "that kind of wrong." He placed a hand on Elias's shoulder, warm, steady, grounding. "Faith shifts sometimes. It trembles. It breaks. It reforms. You are not the first monk to feel shaken." Elias lowered his eyes. He wanted to say, "You have no idea how shaken I am," but the words refused to form. Lucio squeezed his shoulder. "Rest today. Keep to simple tasks. Do not carry this alone." As if he could do anything else. Once Lucio left, Elias pushed the porridge away. His appetite had fled hours ago, somewhere between the angel's wings and the echo of that impossible word. He slipped out of the refectory quickly, ignoring the curious glances. His feet carried him to the cloister, where sunlight washed across the pale stones in soft, glowing layers. He sat on a low bench, hands trembling in his lap, staring at the patch of shade beneath the old cypress tree. His thoughts drifted like torn pages in a storm. Everything felt fragile. Everything felt heavy. He expected fear. He expected awe. He expected some form of spiritual exhilaration. Instead, he felt empty, as if the angel had taken something from him, or left something behind, or both. A strange numbness settled in his bones, a numbness so complete it was almost peaceful. Almost. but beneath it lay something sharp, something waiting, something that would not let him rest. Hours passed. He didn't move. He barely blinked. He simply existed, breathing softly beneath the weight of a sky that seemed suddenly too vast. And though the monastery carried on around him, monks pacing, birds chirping, dust swirling, prayers murmured, Elias remained untouched, a quiet pocket of stillness in the center of ordinary life. He did not pray. He did not think. He did not speak. He sat in the hollow silence and let the world drift past him like incense smoke. At one point, Brother Thomas sat beside him with 2 cups of bitter herb tea. He offered one silently. Elias took it. Thomas sipped his tea thoughtfully, watching a butterfly try, repeatedly and unsuccessfully, to land on a leaf being blown by the wind. Without looking away, Thomas murmured, "You know, when I first burned down the storeroom, I thought God was punishing me." Elias blinked slowly, unsure how to respond. Thomas continued, but Lucio said something wise. He said the divine does not punish, it teaches. Elias exhaled, softly, sadly. "I don't think I'm being taught." "Oh, no," Thomas said cheerfully. "You're definitely being taught. You just haven't figured out the subject yet." Elias closed his eyes. For the first time that day, a tiny, cracked smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Thomas, oblivious to the enormity of last night's events, sipped his tea again and added, "Don't worry, you're smart. You'll pass the exam." Elias did not tell him that the exam involved cosmic intimidation, luminous wings, and a word too ancient for mortals. He simply sipped his tea, letting the bitterness anchor him to the present. Slowly, the day shifted into dusk. Shadows lengthened. The sky softened. The breeze carried cooler air, scented with cypress and fading incense. Elias remained seated, still hollow, still drifting. The silence inside him did not fade, but it settled. It curled up in his chest like a sleeping creature made of dust and light, waiting, watching, breathing with him. And though he feared what it meant, feared what it heralded, he could not deny its presence. Sometimes silence is not absence. Sometimes silence is seed. Sometimes silence is the breath before the next revelation. As night fell, Elias whispered into the quiet, "What have you done to me?" The silence, vast and knowing, answered in its own way, by not answering at all. And so the night deepened, and Elias, hollowed but breathing, sat beneath the darkening sky, the sacred echo still pulsing faintly within him, and knew, with dread, with awe, with reluctant certainty, that this was only the beginning. The night returned with the same soft indifference it had worn the evening before, slipping between the old monastery walls like a thief who had already stolen everything worth taking and had come back only out of habit. The monks settled into their cells one by one, extinguishing lamps, whispering rote prayers, surrendering themselves to sleep with the naive confidence of those whose realities remain blissfully untouched by celestial interference. Elias did not go to his cell. He wandered instead, slowly, quietly, like a half-forgotten spirit, through the dim corridors of the monastery, unsure whether he was walking toward something or simply trying to outrun the silence that had rooted itself inside him. His footsteps echoed softly against the stone, rhythmic and fragile, as though he were tapping out the heartbeat of a new, reluctant life. The air was cool. Dust floated like suspended stars, and somewhere, in the distant corner of the courtyard, an old bronze wind chime trembled, although there was no wind. Elias stopped. That chime never rang unless a storm approached, or unless something unseen brushed past it. He stared at it a long moment, waiting for another faint note, another tremor, anything to confirm that reality was as thin tonight as it had been the night before. Nothing, just the heavy quiet of nighttime stone and sleeping monks. He exhaled shakily. His breath looked like a ghost escaping. He walked on. At some point he found himself standing before the door to the temple hall. It loomed silently, the wood darkened by centuries of ritual and fingerprints of believers who had pressed their doubts and hopes into it, as though the door itself were an oracle. Elias lifted a hand, hesitated, touched it. The wood felt warm, not warm like sun-warmed stone, warm like recollection, like a pulse, like something behind it was awake. He swallowed, hard, and pushed the door open. Inside, the hall was dim. Only a single lantern remained lit, flickering on a small altar where someone had forgotten to extinguish it. The shadows danced across the walls like uncertain monks performing rituals they did not fully remember. Everything looked normal, too normal, which for Elias had become deeply suspicious. He stepped inside, the old boards groaning underfoot. The air thickened around him, a taut, expectant hush, as though the hall itself knew something he didn't. He approached the altar slowly. The little lantern hissed, its flame bending to the side as if it were whispering a warning, or greeting him. "Not again," Elias muttered. "Please, not again." But the silence, faithful companion that it had become, gave no reassurance. He reached out to adjust the wick, and the flame snapped into a perfect column of gold. Straight, rigid, motionless, fire should not behave like that. Elias froze. His pulse leapt into his throat. The flame elongated, stretched upward, became almost needle-thin as though trying to pierce the ceiling, or something beyond it. Then came the sound, a soft, distant hum, like chanting from behind a wall, or memory trying to become voice. Elias's breath hitched. The flame flickered sideways, pointing, not to the altar, not to the door, but to him. The thin golden needle of fire bent toward his chest, trembling, accusatory, almost impatient, like a teacher tapping a student's desk to signal that it was time to answer the question. Elias whispered, "I don't know what you want." The flame brightened. The hum deepened. He felt pressure in the air again. The subtle shift that meant the membrane between his world and the other was thinning, like old parchment about to tear. He stepped back. "No," he said, "no more." The flame hissed sharply, as though offended. Then it collapsed inward, shrinking into a pinprick of white light. Elias blinked, and suddenly the hall wasn't the hall anymore. It was somewhere else, or nowhere, or everywhere. Darkness surrounded him, not oppressive, not cold, but strangely alive, like ink swirling in a vast bowl of water. A faint glow pulsed beneath it, as though distant stars were being born or extinguished at random. He turned in a slow circle. The air tasted metallic. His skin tingled with static. His heartbeat sounded like distant footsteps. "Not a dream," he whispered, but also not waking. A place between, a threshold, a divine afterthought. A whisper rose behind him. He spun, but saw nothing. Then, out of the shifting dark, a shape emerged, not a person, not an angel, not even a silhouette, just a suggestion, a trembling outline, as though someone were erasing a figure while still in the middle of drawing it. The shape flickered. Two vague points glowed where eyes should be. A faint aura pulsed around it, shifting colors like emotions, struggling to decide what they felt. Elias stepped back instinctively. The shape leaned forward. "Prophet." The word was distorted, as if spoken underwater. "I'm not," Elias whispered. The shape flickered violently, dissolving into sparks, then reforming. "Listen." "No, I don't want another message. I'm not ready." The shape shivered, producing a soft ringing sound, not a chime, not metal, something stranger, like glass vibrating in the wind. "The word." Elias stiffened. No, 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 no. He did not want to hear that word again, the one that had carved itself into his ribs, the one he refused to speak, the one he feared thinking about too clearly. "I don't want it," he whispered. But the shape persisted. "The word is changing." Elias blinked in confusion. Changing? Not fixed, not final, not complete. That made no sense. Divine messages were supposed to be absolute, immutable, carved in cosmic stone, not undergoing revisions. Then what was the point of— "Listen." The darkness pulsed. "Something approaches." Elias swallowed. "What?" "Cannot name it. Why not?" "No name yet." A chill crept up his spine. How can something exist without a name? Many things do, until humans ruin them by naming them. Elias exhaled shakily. Fair point. The shape flickered again, edges unraveling like frayed cloth. "Be ready." "For what?" "When the silence speaks." Elias frowned deeply. That makes no sense. The shape trembled. The hall around them, or whatever space this was, rippled like fabric caught in a breeze. Sense is not required. And just like that, the darkness peeled away. The shape dissolved. The glow collapsed. Elias gasped as the world snapped back into place. The temple hall, the altar, the lantern, the flickering flame behaving normally once more, as though none of it had happened. Elias staggered back, nearly tripping over a stray cushion. His breath trembled in his chest, sweat beating at his temples. He touched the altar for balance. It was warm again. Too warm. He whispered, shakily, was that real? Or hunger? Or exhaustion? Or— His voice broke. He looked around the hall, half expecting something else to appear, another figure, another glow, another revelation. Nothing. Silence again. The same hollow, intrusive silence that had followed him all day. He closed his eyes. Something approaches. The words echoed in his skull. What could possibly be worse than what he had already endured? What more could the divine demand? What more could he survive? And that other phrase, when the silence speaks. How can silence speak? How can absence make sound? How can nothing become something? He didn't know. He wasn't sure he wanted to. But deep, deep inside him, past the fear, past the exhaustion, past the fragile edges of sanity, Elias felt it. A stirring, a tremor, a breath inside the silence, something moving, something waking, something not yet named, something not yet shaped, something coming. He shuddered violently, and the worst part, a tiny, treacherous part of him, the part that had always wondered, always questioned, always doubted, felt drawn to it. Curious, afraid, but unable to look away. Ambiguity wrapped itself around him like a cloak, heavy, uncertain, strangely comforting. Was it divine? Was it psychological? Was it hunger? Was it madness? Was it revelation? Was it all of them woven into one shimmering, awful, holy knot? He didn't know. He suspected he would never know. And that, he realized with sudden dread, was the point. Night returned again, not in a rush, not in a blaze, but in that slow, reluctant way darkness sometimes spills back into places where it no longer feels welcome. Elias felt it settle over the monastery like a soft shroud, patient and familiar, the kind of night that knows every crack in the stone, every draft in the corridor, every unanswered prayer lingering in the air like a stubborn ghost. He walked through that night without purpose, without direction, without the faintest idea of what to do with the weight inside him, the silence that had grown teeth, the word that refused to fade, the warning whispered by a shape made of half-formed existence. He felt like a man carrying a lantern with no flame, illuminating nothing except the uncertainty in his own hands. He wandered into the cloister garden, where the moonlight pooled in silver puddles across the pale tiles. The cypress tree swayed faintly in the wind, its branches whispering old secrets to anyone patient, or foolish enough to listen. Elias sat beneath it, pulling his robe tightly around him as though fabric could shield him from revelation. But revelation, he had learned, seeped through everything. A faint breeze brushed his cheek. It felt intentional, which was, of course, unacceptable. He whispered to himself, "This is madness." And for a flicker of a moment he wondered if maybe that was the simplest answer. Maybe he had gone mad quietly, elegantly enough that his madness behaved itself and dressed up as divine encounters. But then, why did the silence still breathe? Why did the words still glow faintly inside his ribs? Why did he feel watched by something that wasn't quite there, but very much was? He pressed his hands against his face and exhaled shakily. "What am I supposed to do?" he murmured into the night. The cypress tree did not answer, but the silence did. Not with sound, with pressure, with presence, with a subtle tightening of the air like the atmosphere preparing to whisper something forbidden. Elias froze. Not again, not here, not now. He stood quickly, too quickly, nearly tripping over a root. His breath clouded in the cool night air. His heart fluttered like a trapped bird. He took a step back. The silence followed. He stepped again. It followed again. Not a thing. An absence pursuing him, a hollow shadow leaning close, a dark, expanding idea that wanted to speak. "No," Elias whispered. "No, please, stay quiet." The night disagreed. A soft, strange vibration hummed through the air, so faint that if he had blinked he might have missed it. It felt like someone brushing a finger along the edge of reality. Not a voice, not a message, not yet, but the promise of one. Elias backed into the stone wall behind him. His chest rose and fell rapidly. He didn't know whether to cover his ears or open them wider. The silence pulsed. Once, twice, slowly, deliberately, like a heartbeat testing its new shape. Then something moved at the far end of the cloister. A shadow, or a ripple, or the suggestion of a figure. Human, angel, echo, hallucination? He squinted, pulse racing. The figure, or shadow, or imagined shape, stood still. Too still. Its outline trembled faintly as if undecided about whether it existed. Elias whispered, barely audible, "Are you real?" The silence answered for it. A soft tightening, a subtle deepening, a strange intimacy, as though the night itself leaned in close to his ear. Elias's throat tightened. "Just leave me alone," he pleaded. The figure shifted slightly, not closer, not away, just enough to confirm, yes, it was there, and yes, it was aware of him. His breath shook. "What do you want?" He didn't raise his voice. He hardly had one left. The night seemed to swallow the question. The figure did not move. But the silence, oh, the silence, responded. It opened. Not physically, not visibly, but in the way a secret opens in the mind the moment you become dangerous enough to understand it. And Elias felt it. Deep in his chest, deep in his bones, deep in that trembling place between thought and fear. The beginning of a message forming. Not a word, not a sentence. Something more primal, more foundational. A pre-language. A crack forming in the border between the human and the divine. He closed his eyes. Tears gathered. He whispered, "I can't do this." But the silence was mercilessly patient. A breath of cold air passed behind him. Then another, as though two unseen presences had taken their places at his shoulders. He squeezed his eyes tighter. "Please," he whispered, "I'm not ready." The silence pulsed again, not reassuring him, not comforting him, but acknowledging him, as if saying, "Readiness is not part of the job description." He sank to his knees. The world tilted. The air trembled like wet parchment. The old monastery, the cypress tree, the courtyard, everything felt thinner, as though existence itself was being stretched to make room for something else. He lifted trembling hands, covered his ears, covered nothing, because the silence was inside him now, no longer external, no longer something he could walk away from. It pulsed in his chest. It pressed behind his eyes. It vibrated in his spine. The shadow across the cloister shifted again, or maybe multiplied, or maybe dissolved slightly at the edges. He whispered, "What are you?" The silence responded, not with a word, but with a sensation, a soft clicking, like an ancient lock being opened. His breath caught, his heart lurched. He felt a presence leaning in, not divine, not demonic, not definable, just other. Something in the process of becoming. Something searching for form. Something almost ready to speak. He backed away on his hands, scrambling across the stone floor. The shadow did not follow, but the silence moved with him like a loyal, terrifying companion. Finally, he reached the doorway of the hall. He stumbled inside, collapsed against a pillar, pressed his forehead into the cold stone. His breath shook violently. His skin crawled with static. The silence throbbed against the inside of his skull like someone knocking politely on a very fragile door. He whispered brokenly, "What do you want from me?" The silence pulsed again, gentle, steady, inevitable, and then, very faintly, as if the universe were inhaling through the smallest possible crack, he heard it. Something, not quite a voice, not quite a thought, not quite sound, a beginning, barely born, barely real, something speaking inside the silence, a message that was not yet language, a prophecy not yet shaped, a truth not yet willing to reveal itself. The sensation passed through him like a cold ripple in warm water. His entire body flinched. His teeth chattered. His breath caught in his throat. And then it stopped. Just stopped. The silence retreated. Not gone, never gone, just waiting, patient, poised. Elias slumped onto the floor, trembling so hard he could barely lift his hands. He stared into the dim hall, vision swimming. He knew one thing with absolute certainty. Something had begun, something irreversible, something vast, something that would not allow him to return to the quiet, tiny life he had loved. He didn't know what the figure was. He didn't know what the silence intended. He didn't know what the approaching something wanted. But he knew, with the horrible, sacred clarity of a reluctant prophet, that the message was not finished, that the divine was not done, that he was only at the edge of whatever abyss fate had carved for him. He whispered weakly, "God, are you even in this?" No answer. Of course. Perhaps God was busy, or asleep, or laughing behind a constellation, or simply avoiding messages. You know, the way everyone does on Mondays. Elias let out a breath that sounded like defeat and acceptance woven together. The night outside rustled softly. The figure in the cloister had vanished, but the silence remained. Inside him, around him, waiting for its moment to speak again. And that, he realized, was the most terrifying thing of all. The next revelation would not come from above. It would come from within. Night had grown old by the time Elias finally rose from the cold stone floor of the hall. The lantern flames had dwindled to thin blue whispers, their glow trembling like elderly souls trying to remember why they were still burning. The monastery lay in the hush of pre-dawn, wrapped in shadows so soft they seemed woven from worn-out prayers. Elias felt the weight of everything he had lived, dream, revelation, silence, shadow, pressing against the inside of his ribs. Not crushing, no, just there, like an unwelcome tenant who had moved into his chest and begun rearranging the furniture. His body felt weak. His breath felt shallow. His mind felt stretched, as though he were made of parchment pulled too tightly across a frame. He stepped outside into the courtyard. The moon was sinking behind the hills, thin and pale, like a coin worn smooth by centuries of hands. The wind carried the faint scent of ash from earlier incense, and early birds mumbled sleepy songs as though practicing before the sun noticed. Elias stood beneath the cypress tree, the same tree under which the shadow had lingered, the same tree whose roots had felt the trembling of revelation, the same tree that seemed older tonight, older, wiser, and slightly disappointed that he had not run away yet. He looked up at the sky. It stared back, vast, indifferent, ancient, and he whispered softly, "I don't know what you want from me." The sky said nothing. It never did. But the silence that followed felt attentive, as though listening, as though waiting, as though amused by his reluctance. He placed a hand over his chest, feeling the faint pulse of the word the angel had left inside him. It no longer burned. It shimmered, subtle, persistent, like the glow of an ember buried beneath ash. He feared it, and yet some dangerous part of him felt drawn to it. That was the worst part of becoming a prophet. Not the fear, not the divine bureaucracy, not the cosmic interruptions, no. It was the slow realization that a piece of you, some secret, unnameable part, wanted to understand, wanted to follow the thread, wanted to see what lay beyond the silence. Terrifying and irresistible. He breathed deeply, the cold air filling the cracks inside him. A rustle sounded behind him, soft footsteps. Brother Lucio appeared, his robe tugged by the wind, his face drawn with concern, and the kind of half-awake wisdom possessed only by monks and sleep-deprived philosophers. "You haven't slept," Lucio murmured gently. "No," Elias admitted. Lucio stepped beside him beneath the cypress tree, folding his hands into his sleeves. "Is it doubt?" Elias hesitated. "No," he whispered. "It's something else." Lucio nodded slowly, as though he had expected that answer. The soul sometimes walks ahead of the body, and sometimes it lags behind. The space between can feel frightening. Elias exhaled shakily. "I think something is coming." Lucio studied him, the wind brushing the hem of his robe. "Do you know what?" "No." "Do you know when?" "No." "Do you know why?" Elias almost laughed, but the sound died in his throat. "No." Lucio smiled softly, the kind of smile worn by those who trust in things they cannot explain. "Then you are exactly where many prophets once stood." Elias winced. "I don't want to stand where they stood." Lucio's smile deepened, full of sympathy and irony. "No one ever does." A long silence stretched between them, warm as a blanket, sharp as a blade. It didn't weigh on Elias the way the earlier silence had. This one was human, gentle, honest. Lucio touched his shoulder. "Rest when you can. And remember, whatever approaches, you are not alone." Elias wished he believed that. Lucio walked away, disappearing into the corridors. His footsteps faded. The courtyard breathed. Elias stood alone with the cypress tree and the cold air, and the endless, listening silence. He closed his eyes, and there it was, deep, faint, like a heartbeat inside the void. The almost voice he had heard earlier, the whisper that wasn't a whisper, the message forming but not yet spoken. His breath trembled. He didn't understand it. He couldn't define it. He couldn't even decide whether it was holy or a hallucination. But it was real, real enough to change the temperature of the night, real enough to leave a residual taste of electricity on his tongue, real enough to be waiting. He opened his eyes. The world felt delicately balanced, as though one wrong breath might tilt it into revelation. He whispered into the cool air, "I'm not a prophet." The silence responded by not believing him. He tried again, "I'm not ready." The silence responded by existing anyway. He pressed a hand to the cypress trunk. Its bark was cold. Its roots hummed faintly beneath his touch, as though remembering the presence that had stood nearby. And suddenly, all at once, Elias felt something. Not a message, not a command, not a divine shove into responsibility. Something gentler, something stranger. Something like someone setting a candle on a table in a dark room and letting you decide whether to light it. A choice, or the illusion of one, which, with the divine, is often the same thing. He stepped back, looked around the courtyard, felt the night leaning toward dawn. He whispered to no one, "What happens now?" The silence didn't answer, but it didn't need to. The answer was in the tremble beneath his skin, the subtle pressure in the air, the faint presence lingering just beyond perception, and the word glowing like an ember in his chest. What happens now is whatever happens when a reluctant prophet tries to return to being a simple monk while carrying a message that hasn't finished forming from a silence, that hasn't finished speaking for a world that hasn't finished listening. He took a slow breath, turned toward the dim corridor leading back into the monastery, and walked, one step after another, calm, unsteady, certain of nothing, burdened by everything. And as he disappeared into the shadows, the courtyard exhaled, the wind shifted, the cypress tree rustled as though whispering prophecy, and the silence, faithful, patient, inevitable, followed him inside. Maybe God would speak again, maybe the angel would return, maybe the shadow would take shape, maybe the silence would finally find its voice, or maybe, as Elias suspected with a bitterness he couldn't quite shake, God was simply busy, or tired, or avoiding messages the way everyone avoids responsibilities on a Monday morning. Either way, the night held its breath one last time. A single candle on an abandoned altar flickered, wavered, leaned, and went out, leaving nothing but the soft shimmer of dust and a silence heavy enough to reshape the world. And so ends, for now, this chapter of a reluctant prophet and the divine chaos that chose him. But the story is not finished, not even close, because prophecy never ends. It merely pauses in the quiet between revelations. If this story kept you awake a little longer tonight, subscribe to Religious Night Stories, where faith never sleeps, even if you do.